Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today for the 23rd consecutive program in this weekly America at a Crossroads series. I greet you on behalf of the Jews United and the Community Advocates leadership, David Lair, Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Carolyn Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen. And thank you to our valued co-sponsors, Temple Beth Am, Valley Beth Shalom, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Leo Beck Temple, ICAR, Stephen Wise, The Forward, and the Holocaust Museum of LA, as well as Jewish Center for Justice. Remember, Wednesdays from 5 to 6 LA time, you are ours. Next week, we will welcome the legendary Carl Bernstein, then Planned Parenthood's President Alexis McGill Johnson, joined by former Congressman Henry Waxman, followed by two former Secretaries of Homeland Security, Governors Ridge and Napolitano, followed by David Gergen, and then David Axelrod. Quite an incredible lineup. In between Gergen and Axelrod, we added a special event on Thursday, October 22nd with Alexander Vindman and Max Boot. And then on the Sunday before elections, our special 2-hour program with a host of amazing analysts, including Jennifer Rubin, Max Boot, Bob Schrum, and many others. Be sure to sign up today. And we took your response to our poll quite seriously. We will be continuing these programs after the election. Today we got confirmation from two of our most popular former guests who agreed to command visits in November, Ron Brownstein and Bill Kristol. Stay tuned for the details. We are all very excited to hear from one of my personal heroes tonight, Nick Kristof. His column in 2004 about the Darfur genocide was the catalyst which prompted the late Rabbi Schulweis and me to start Jewish World Watch, an organization which continues 16 years later to fight various genocides around the world. But before we start, we wanted to briefly honor the memory of the great Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There have been 114 justices on the Supreme Court since 1789, but only one of them became a rock star for the ages. At her core, Justice Ginsburg was committed to elevating the powerless, to empowering the vulnerable, and to bringing justice and equality based on this simple concept of fairness. In speeches, she frequently attributed her lifelong pursuit of justice to her Jewish roots. Her rise in popularity coincided with her stinging dissents, in which she displayed her courage and conscience as she spoke truth to power. Longtime NPR legal affairs correspondent Nina Tottenberg tweeted about the special significance of the timing of Justice Ginsburg's death. A Jewish teaching says, those who die just before the Jewish New Year are the ones God has held back until the very last moment because they were needed most and were the most righteous. Let us not lose sight of how remarkable it is that it is the millennial generation, that is young American women, who elevated a tiny octogenarian Jewish mother and bubby named Ruth Bader Ginsburg into the iconic, notorious RBG. While she certainly deserves to rest in peace, we suspect that she probably isn't doing that quite yet. But Justice Ginsburg, you more than did your part. We honor you and dedicate tonight's session to your indelible memory. I now will hand you off to my extraordinary partner, David Lehrer.
Thank you, Janice. On behalf of Community Advocates, I'm pleased to join and welcome you to another of our America at a Crossroads virtual town halls. Our Wednesday evening programs keep expanding in popularity. Tonight, we have over 4,500 registrants. Our lineup of speakers has been extraordinary, a virtually unparalleled array of superstar pundits, Pulitzer Prize winners, brilliant analysts, and smart politicos. But judging by the feedback we received, it isn't just the headliners that are resonating with our audience. Rather, it is that our initial assumption was correct, that you are looking to have more nuanced discussions than are generally available, ones that are challenging, vigorous, and occasionally adversarial from partisans and analysts alike. We have endeavored to explore tough issues in the hope that you will think about the topics our mavens discuss, and it seems to be working. This week's program is a perfect example. Our guest, Nicholas Kristof, is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, an esteemed twice-weekly columnist on the New York Times op-ed page, who has been described as having remade the concept of the op-ed with his concern about human rights abuses and social injustice. He will be discussing those concerns and much more. His most recent book, Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope, co-authored with his wife, Cheryl Wudon, a fellow Pulitzer Prize winner, will be featured in a photo exhibit based on their book this January at the Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles. Tonight, we also offer you an extraordinary opportunity, the chance to purchase signed copies of Nick's book. After the program, we will share a link to his favorite hometown bookstore that will make this possible. If you need the information later on, just write off. Nick Kristof is one of a kind, and we are especially lucky to have him with us. He will be in dialogue with one of LA's treasures, KCRW's Madeleine Brand, host of the daily broadcast Press Play, and a popular personality on NPR both locally and nationally. This is her third time moderating one of our programs, and she'll be back again in 2 weeks. The subject of tonight's program is A Ray of Hope in a Grim Time. Madeleine?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Janice, so much for having me back. It's such a pleasure. And I'm very excited to offer, or at least hear the offerings of A Ray of Hope from Nick Kristof. I've been a big fan of his for a long time and loved his book, Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope, not only because it does describe our national malaise and all the problems that we are now facing very starkly right now, but also because it does offer a list of very positive suggestions at the end of the book. So, Nick, I just want to open tonight's discussion by asking you to talk about hope at the beginning. Maybe we'll have a hope sandwich for tonight's discussion. 200,000 Americans are dead. Millions have lost their jobs. We are experiencing climate disaster. You're in Oregon right now. We're in California. We are seeing it up close and personal. How do you have hope? Why should this be a moment for hope?
Well, thanks, Madeleine, and thanks to all of you for joining in. And let me try to offer a little ray of hope without being too Panglossian. And I should say that I have a ray of hope on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I despair. So, there's evidence both ways. But I would argue that, frankly, the United States is such a mess today that it creates more opportunities for change in this election and next January. And I'd make some parallel with the 1932 election. It was precisely because Herbert Hoover had failed so cataclysmically that not only was Franklin Roosevelt elected, but he was elected with a real mandate. And the Senate flipped that year for the first time, I think, since 1918. And led, of course, to the New Deal and the real milestones to develop modern middle class. And likewise, we argue, Cheryl and I argue in Tightrope, that what has gone wrong in America is not just President Trump. He, in some ways, is a symptom of something much deeper. That we have 50 years of policies that, frankly, under Republicans and Democrats alike, have poorly served the American people. And maybe the fact that this cataclysm has fallen upon us will be a wake-up call to some folks. I mean, in times of, normally we suffer from chronic diseases, and when you have chronic diseases, it may not be quite so apparent that the lack of universal health care is an abomination. In a time of infectious disease, we all feel threatened because so many people slip through the cracks. Likewise, the fact that we are the only advanced country in the world that doesn't have universal paid sick leave. In a time of chronic disease, we may not think about that. In a time of infectious disease, everybody worries about who they interact with. So, Madeleine, I don't want to predict that we will that this will be what will push us to address some of these longstanding problems, but I think we at least have a chance to finally address some longstanding inequities in this country. The fact that we have the highest child poverty rate in the advanced world, that we don't have universal health care, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to me that the odds that we finally bite the bullet and address these problems are perhaps a little bit higher now, precisely because of the magnitude of our national failings.
Yeah. Well, do you see this as a partisan issue? In other words, if the Republicans remain in control of the presidency and the Senate, does very little change and we fail to seize this moment? Or do you see this as such a big crisis, such a massive undertaking and a massive need that affects everybody, no matter their political stripe, that they too will be moved to adopt some of these policies that, frankly, have been talked about more on the left side of the political equation for many decades than the right side. And how is that playing where you are in a part of Oregon where there are a lot of Trump supporters?
Right. Look, if the Senate were to remain in Republican hands, then I don't think a lot of really crucial steps would be taken at the national level. But I do think that there is some opportunity, some awakening that does cut across parties. And for example, you look at mass incarceration, which I think was one of the single worst mistakes America has made. Since until 1970, the United States had incarceration rates that were similar to those of other advanced countries, and then the number of people incarcerated in the US rose sevenfold. Well, mass incarceration has begun to come down again. It's been led by states like Texas. You've had states like Utah and Idaho, red states that have expanded Medicaid belatedly. And early childhood education, early childhood interventions, which I think are maybe the single strongest evidence-based approach that would provide greater opportunity. Those actually, you have had some action at the state level by red states as well. Oklahoma has been a leader. For about 50 years, we've been in the business of cutting taxes and cutting investments in America's human capital. And I wonder if history doesn't sort of work in cycles to some degree, as Arthur Schlesinger wrote. And when Kansas Republicans rebelled against Sam Brownback's tax cuts and said, our schools have been cut too badly, tax us more. I wonder if that may not be remembered as a turning point. So it does seem to me that there are larger forces at work. And I see that here in Yamhill, here I am on the family farm in Yamhill, Oregon. Population 1,000 on a good day, and this is a place that voted for President Trump, that will probably still vote this year to re-elect President Trump, and yet on economic issues, people would like to see the federal minimum wage raised. I think they'd like to see some kind of a national pre-K begun. Bandwidth for all would go over really well here. So there may be opportunities, especially at the state level, even if the Democrats don't win the Senate, but it would go a lot more smoothly if the Democrats had a clean sweep.
Well, I think a lot of people who are not in rural America, who are maybe in more blue environment, like us here in Los Angeles, are wondering why people in rural America, like Yamhill, are still supporting President Trump. Have they seen any benefits in the last 4 years from him and his presidency?
It depends on who they are. So there's certainly a large share of evangelical Christians who care deeply about issues of abortion, who regard every abortion as a murder, and for them, conservative justices are a huge priority, and so they feel that they got what they voted for, and now, particularly, I cringe at the thought of Ruth Bader Ginsburg being replaced by the people who are being talked about, but a lot of folks in Yamhill would applaud that. Likewise, some people here care deeply about gun policy, and that too, I think they feel vindicated. But on the economy, until January, I think there were I have a very good neighbor right down the road, and whenever we had sort of somewhat strained conversations about President Trump, he would say, well, my business is going really well. Then in March, it kind of collapsed. And, I think people see that. I think there are a lot of rumors here about COVID. There's a lot of distrust about whether COVID is real, a lot of resistance to masks. But people see that the economy is a complete mess. They see that there are a lot of people who are unemployed now. People are struggling to put food on the table. And I think that they do hold that against President Trump, and maybe are more likely in November to vote those pocketbook issues as opposed to cultural issues than they might have been in the past.
Mm. But I guess the question is, do they blame President Trump for that, or do they blame the Democratic governor? Do they blame local officials? How much are they saying, look, this stops at the White House?
You know, I think that a lot of the issues that Democrats have talked about, they don't blame President Trump for. The Ukraine scandals, the impeachment probably helped President Trump around here as it probably did nationally. On the other hand, healthcare is an issue that people are nervous about losing. They somewhat distrust President Trump on that. On COVID, there's so many wild conspiracy theories in places like this and around the country that I don't think people are quite sure what to make of it. They don't entirely believe President Trump, but they don't really know. The economy, though, I mean, there's just no hiding the fact that the economy is a mess. I mean, there are 11.5 million fewer people employed now than in February, and and the fact that Congress hasn't extended the emergency benefits, I think that that is something that they do blame President Trump for, even as they also blame the governor here, or likewise in other states often blame Democratic cities and states for what they see as misrule. But President Trump, there is some effort to hold him accountable for the economy.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Well, and then exacerbating that would be the fires. And not only is there a danger of people's entire, homes and blocks and towns being burned to the ground and them losing everything, but it's really affecting the state's timber industry, from what I understand as well. So that's a double economic hit to the state of Oregon and to people who are living precariously, people on the edge. And so how are they handling that and talking about the larger issue of climate change?
Madeleine, when the fires happened, I thought, okay, finally people are going to accept the reality of climate change and the need to address it. And, farmers and foresters, they're outdoors every day. They see the climate changing. They see that crops are being harvested earlier, that they need to plant crops earlier, things are blooming earlier. The foresters see that trees are drier. And so, I thought, okay, finally there's going to be a little more political will to address climate change given the fires and the smoke. And what just kind of broke my heart was how many people here, old friends, called me up and said, yeah, you hear it's all those arsonists, right? Yeah, it's Black Lives Matter arsonists or Antifa arsonists. And I follow people's Facebook pages, and there are these just wild narratives about conspiracy theories about how this isn't climate change. This is actually these Antifa arsonists. And when you have the science is so clear that climate change is a major factor at work. And I just think that, boy, if we can't even get some consensus when the evidence is so overwhelmingly clear, and when there's no evidence for Antifa arson, and yet we're still seeing all this wild conjuring of conspiracy theories, then what happens in November after a close election, when you likewise have all these conspiracy theories about fake ballots being cast, et cetera, et cetera. I worry about that.
It's frightening when you think that a lot of this is coming from the very top, the president fueling these ideas that this could be a bogus election if he loses. And quite frankly, saying out loud that he'll contest the election, that he won't accept the results if he is declared the loser in this. There's an article that came out today in The Atlantic that a lot of people are talking about, and I think you read it, by Barton Gellman, which envisions a truly nightmare scenario in which swing state legislatures that are Republican controlled will appoint electors to basically say, President Trump won our state, and that they're planning for that. So I wonder if you could comment on that and if you think that is a likely scenario.
Bart Gellman, who wrote that article, he's a first-rate journalist. He's a very old friend of mine. I encourage you to read the article. It is really scary. And there are, I think, some elements that are more likely than others. I mean, you know, look, at the end of the day, the Republican Party right now is in the business of suppressing votes, and they have made that from party. It's more people of color voting, it's more young people voting, and those tend to vote Democratic. And the GOP is fairly open about that issue. And because there will be more mail-in voting, there are always more mail-in votes that are problematic than there are in-person votes, you know, because somebody an address doesn't quite match somebody, you know, it's a street versus an avenue, or written as a number, or somebody is a James versus Jim, et cetera. And so there are always more of the, or people, they mail in their ballot, but they don't put it in the security envelope inside the overall envelope. And, you know, does that get tossed out? And so I think that there will be a real effort to discredit those votes and have them not count. And that, I think, is going to be much more common than it has been in past years. I think, though, that Madeleine, I mean, the big issue that you raise is whether some states will say that will contest the results turned by professionals and say there was fraudulent voting, and then, you know, for example, a state legislature and certify electors for President Trump rather than those for Joe Biden. And, you know, could that happen? I mean, I don't think it's likely, but I think it could. And we always used to read about the 1876 election between Hayes and Tilden and think, oh, that was a different America. When you may have had an election stolen like that, and the chaos, nobody knowing who was going to be president. That a possibility for the next few months? Absolutely. You know, it's funny for me. I've covered coups and chaotic societies all over the world, and, you know, these sort of crazy checkpoints by armed militias. And then here I am in my beloved home state of Oregon. And, you know, there were these militia checkpoints to look for Antifa arsonists in this state I love by, you know, people the kind of people that I grew up with, and an election that is as messy as an election, you know, that I used to mock in some developing countries. And it's just so incredibly sad, Madeleine, to see these things happening in this country. Or, you know, or COVID. I used to look at President Mbeki in South Africa and his denialism about AIDS and how that killed South African citizens. And now I see denialism by an American president that results in dead American citizens. So it's in that respect, I'm not giving you that ray of hope that I promised, but
I know. I wanted to ask you, I wanted to follow up on that because, you know, if anyone has reached across the cultural aisle, so to speak, you have in your book. You grew up with a lot of the people that you politically disagree with. And you have spent a long time trying to understand them. And I think a lot of us have tried to understand the other side and try to figure out, well, what are they thinking and how can we possibly find areas of commonality and stitch this country back together again. Are you feeling more or less hopeful about that as you see what's happening during this election season?
I think that period after the election will be a crucible, a period of maximum danger for the country, for social unrest, for all kinds of legal pettifoggery. But I do cling to this broader idea that I mentioned. Look, the United States for 50 years has adopted a lot of policies that I think are, we just took a fundamental wrong turn. We were the only country not to have universal health care, not to have universal paid sick leave. We eviscerated labor unions in a way that did not happen in Europe. We underfunded job training in a way that did not happen before. We went from being #1 country in high school graduation rates in the world. We invented the mass high school to having 30 odd countries eclipse us in high school graduation rates. And where we were #1, we think of America as #1, we're #1 as child poverty rates. And so in America, in some ways, I think has a kind of a cancer. And I saw that growing up here. And one of the things we write about in Tightrope is a quarter of the kids on my old school bus are now dead from drugs, alcohol, and suicide, and deaths of despair. And that was all long before President Trump came along. In some ways, they voted for President Trump as kind of a cri de coeur because there was such despair in places like this. And I do think that there is a scenario that is more likely than renewal of the Hayes-Tilden 1876 election, in which Joe Biden wins the presidency with a Democratic Senate, with a mandate, and begins to write the course of the country and move on issues like healthcare and like climate and like universal access to early childhood programs in ways that would begin to fix 50 years of mistakes. So, this really truly is a turning point. And we journalists are obviously not great at making predictions, but I think that is a scenario that's when I wake up at 4 a.m. and worry about the kind that Bart wrote about in The Atlantic, what sends me back to sleep is the hope for that alternative that I address. It gives us a fighting chance of addressing some of these long-standing inequities.
Well, do you see Joe Biden as a transformational figure, as someone who can rise to the moment the way FDR did?
I think that it is possible. I think it's very hard to predict, but FDR was not considered a transformational figure in 1932, and then the Depression made him one. The Depression and the fact that he won this mandate and that he was able to flip the Senate. And likewise, I think that Biden is beginning to talk to his advisors, making that same 1932 comparison. He has talked about some really broad, sweeping changes, like universal childcare and pre-K, which would make such a difference for struggling families in this country. Giving labor unions, a little bit more power to represent the working class, universal health care. And there's, in the primaries, there was so much debate about whether it had to be a single payer system or a multi-payer system. What matters is universality, not whether it's single payer or multi-payer. So I think that there is some real chance that a Biden administration, if it had a mandate, if it had the Senate with it, would indeed rise to the occasion in a way that FDR likewise rose to the occasion in ways that were not fully anticipated in 1932.
Is there a danger, though, that this is the only moment, and if he fails to seize it, then that's it for any of these proposals, that he's got to really think big, or as they say, go home? That his inclination as a creature of the Senate for so many years, and then as the vice president, was to be incremental and reach across the aisle and forge compromises. Is that not the perfect strategy for this moment? Does it need to be like, you know, the New Deal type reimagining of our society for any of this, for us to have a renewed faith that this country can work for more people?
You're right. I think that it's going to be very difficult to work across the aisle to have some of these kinds of broad national programs. There may actually be some, I mean, bandwidth for all is one actually that might play well in some Republican states. It polls exceptionally well. It's modeled on rural electrification, which transformed communities like this one. But in general, I think, you know, cooperation with the GOP did not work terribly well for the Obama administration. I doubt if it would work terribly well for a Biden administration. On the other hand, I do think it makes Biden more electable, and that for a lot of people who are wavering in places like this, who distrusted Hillary Clinton, so they are wary of President Trump, and people aren't really scared of Joe Biden. I mean, these efforts by the Republicans to paint Biden as some kind of scary socialist, you know, he's just not a scary figure. And part of that is his eminent reasonableness, which may mitigate his capacity to provide the far-reaching changes we aspire to, but may make it more likely to get in a position to do so.
How do your Yamhill neighbors feel about Joe Biden?
You know, there was a lot of animosity toward Hillary Clinton 4 years ago, which in some cases I think was really rooted just in misogyny. Biden doesn't prompt the passions either among people who will vote for him or the hostility among those who might oppose him. One of the people we write about in Tightrope is my old 7th grade crush, Mary, and she knows firsthand just how badly things have gone for working class Americans. She's very smart, very capable, but she ended up with addictions to meth and alcohol, was homeless for 7 years, and now is back and doing okay. But I asked her at some point whether she thought that there was ever a political solution to the kinds of problems that she faced and so many others did. And she said that traditionally she had not thought that there was a political answer, but that in 2016, she actually did. And listening to Donald Trump talk about bringing jobs back, she thought, yeah. And so she voted for him in 2006, voted for the first time in her life for Donald Trump. This year, she is undecided, but I think she likes Trump's conservative judges. On the other hand, she quite distrusts him, and she doesn't really have views about Biden, strong views about Biden. And one of the things in places like this that really turned people off Trump was his efforts to hamstring the post office. The post office is lifeblood in so many parts of America, and that and the economy, of course. Mary survives by making birdhouses and selling them, and she has to go to farmers markets to sell these, and the farmers markets have largely been closed. So I think the economy, and coupled with the fact that COVID-19 may well get worse in the US, that we're seeing an uptick in cases now. A lot of the models predict worsening of COVID between now and the election. I think that will take away some of those votes that Trump got in 2016.
Although you're saying that your neighbors are still largely Trump supporters.
Yeah, I mean, what you want is, to get those 18 people across America who are still undecided. So yeah, Yamhill will still, a majority of Yamhill, I'm sure, will still vote for Trump. But I think it may well be that there will be a smaller majority for him this time, that there will be some defections. And, if we see that in Arizona, in North Carolina, in Michigan, Pennsylvania, et cetera, then we have a chance to re-engineer this country in ways that I think will help address a lot of really deep-seated problems.
Mm. I think what flummoxes a lot of people is when you apply the old Reagan adage, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Probably 99.9% of America, excluding Jeff Bezos, would say no. So
Yeah.
Why isn't it going to be a landslide? Why are the polls so close? It appears that in most polls, the numbers haven't really moved in months.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And it's an interesting contrast with George W. Bush, who you may remember that when Iraq was a real mess, that his approval rating dropped to 19%. And you haven't seen that kind of a plunge with Trump. So I think that actually part of the reason for that lies with the way Trump supporters feel that progressives respond to them. And progressives have been so outraged, rightly, by Trump's actions that they have, wrongly, I think, tended to dismiss every Trump voter as a racist and a bigot and an idiot. And I think that has created a certain amount of defensiveness in some of the Trump supporters. And I'm struck by how many of them seize on the word deplorable and self-identify as deplorable, and think that every New York Times columnist and every liberal thinks that white working class Americans are deplorable. And I think that we have to be really careful not to dismiss every Trump voter as a bigot and an idiot, because it is really hard to win votes from people, not only for the presidency, but also for the Senate, for House seats, for state legislature seats, when you're dismissing those voters as racists and bigots.
We're getting tons and tons of questions from listeners or watchers. I always say listeners because I'm radio biased. So I want to post some of them. The latest one I received, someone asks, why did you succeed? Why so many of your classmates didn't? What's your secret sauce?
My secret sauce is my parents and the family that I grew up in. So my parents were academics who commuted to Portland. This farm is really beyond the commuting range, but my parents were kind of crazy and didn't realize the distance. And so they commuted. And so I grew up in a home surrounded by books. I was hugged, I was read to. And we tend to think of poverty in terms of metrics of income or wealth. The most important metrics of child poverty are how often you are hugged and how often you are read to as a child, how many children's books there are in the home. The family that got on the bus right after I did each morning, right down the hill from here, were the 5 Knapp kids, Farland, who was my year, Zealand, Nathan, Regina, and Keelan. Not one of them graduated from high school. Farland, after he lost his job, self-medicated with alcohol and drugs, died of liver failure as a result. Zealand died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. Regina died of hepatitis from injecting drugs. And Keelan died just this spring after COVID had already begun at the end of March from a heroin overdose. And I just, I think of those 5 kids who were smart and talented and had so much to offer. And we all as a society spent so much time investing in their incarceration. And if instead we had invested in their education and been able to, we couldn't have fully replicated what I got here from my parents, but we could have. There were programs, home visitation programs, book loan programs, things like reading partners, literacy tutoring programs that might have helped. We could have worked harder to get them to graduate from high school, to get them vocational training. And I do think that if I had been in the Knapp's household and Farland had been in this household, then our trajectories might well have been reversed. It wasn't, I think too often people who were successful look in the mirror and they, compliment that person. You worked hard and you were smart and so on. Yeah, maybe, but most of all, you won the lottery of birth. And that's what I did.
Yeah. And I guess Trump spoke to that. He saw them. He said, I see you, in a way that Hillary Clinton wasn't able to convince them that she also felt their pain or saw them, however disingenuous it may have been on his part. I think
Trump was very good at promising. Trump didn't talk about policies, he talked about outcomes. We said, yeah, jobs are coming back. You're going to get those jobs back. And it wasn't true. But when you're in a desperate strait and you've seen, I talked about Mary earlier. I think 4 of her family members had committed suicide. She at one point had held a gun to her head and thought about it. When you're that desperate and have seen that much pain around you and have lost that many friends, then you're maybe a little more willing to listen to and believe a charlatan. And I think that's what happened.
So has the Democratic Party learned its lessons? Has it tried more assiduously to reach out to this group of people this time around?
I think that it has tried a little bit harder, but I don't think it has tried hard enough. I do worry about a sense of condescension that comes from many Democratic quarters to these working class voters. And the fact that there are an awful lot of union members who are going to be voting for Trump this fall is just completely crazy. Bobby Kennedy, I think, was maybe the last Democrat who really was just brilliant at speaking to working class voters and listening to them rather than preaching. And Bobby Kennedy tried very, very hard to build an alliance between Black working class voters and white working class voters who have so many interests in common and so often vote in divergent ways. And I think that the Democrats today have a lot to learn from Bobby Kennedy and the way he listened. And I think a lot of my friends here in Yamhill would say, and when Tightrope came out, we were a little nervous about how they would react to it, because here, I'm a liberal, I'm preaching all these liberal solutions, and they were okay with that. And at the end of the day, they don't want your sympathy. What they want is respect. And I think that they feel that Democrats are too often looking down on them as racists and bigots and not listening to or understanding their pain, and that Trump at least pretended to hear that pain and to promise outcomes that for people who were desperate sounded good.
Another listener asks, Lynn, do you attribute your neighbor's views, at least in part, to Fox? What is the role of Fox News in all of this?
I think Fox is a significant shaper of views around here, but I would say that Facebook is probably even more important. And because my Facebook feed is half friends from the New York Times or from Washington and then half friends from Yamhill, it's like being in 2 different worlds. But if you just got the Facebook feeds from people around here, then you see your one extremist bizarre take after another. And if you live in that orbit, if you live in that universe through, selective bias, which is a problem for all of us, then I think it's easier to understand how you have some of these views about America and about the election. So I think Facebook has to do a much, much better job and has to be held accountable for the fact that whatever it says, it is an incredibly important news source that is spreading misinformation that in some cases creates, I think, real violence. When people here in Oregon were setting up militia checkpoints to hunt for Antifa arsonists, that was because of stuff spreading on Facebook. Earlier in this summer, there were a lot of communities in Oregon that went through this hysteria that buses of Antifa were on their way to bust up their towns and burn their towns, which was just completely ludicrous. But those rumors too, I mean, that wasn't on Fox News. Fox News to some degree magnified the hysteria about Antifa, but that was really Facebook that was spreading these things. And I think that Facebook has to do a better job of not being used in ways that truly damage the country.
Which then brings back the whole fear about the election and what's going to happen after November 3rd and Facebook's role in that, and what people will be reading about whether this election was stolen from them or what they should do to take it back.
Absolutely. I mean, I covered the genocide in Myanmar against the Rohingya, and I saw how Facebook was used in Myanmar to spread these vicious rumors about how the Rohingya had, raped some Bamar girl or murdered some Bamar family, and then the local community would rise up against the Rohingya and torch their villages. And the Facebook played a real role in those massacres and in that genocide. And I used to be a champion of Facebook. It certainly took some steps to remedy that in Myanmar. It says it's going to be very careful about spreading misinformation in this election cycle, but I've learned to be a little skeptical of things coming out of Facebook.
They are promising some kind of election project.
That's right. I mean, they also promised that they were going to take off any misinformation about Antifa arsonists, and yet so many, Facebook groups were spreading information about these Antifa arsonists and leading to those checkpoints. And it's a hard nut to tackle. It's a difficult job. There are more problems online than there are solutions, but I don't think that they have tried as hard as they could. And at the New York Times, we moderate comments, and so you don't get people saying that there are crazy arsonists who were headed out to burn some town. Come on out. And it's more expensive to moderate those comments. It interrupts our business model. But if you care about the society, if you think you're serving that society, that's an expense that you have to pay.
Do you think that Facebook needs to be either broken up or regulated by the government to make sure that they don't, let these posts exist? I mean, you're a journalist, obviously in favor of the First Amendment. It can be a difficult line, a difficult thread there to allow free expression on this site and yet also make sure that misinformation isn't spread. Should that be regulated?
So, this is something that I wrestle with. I'm a little unsure, exactly how one would go about the regulation, but two, I have come to change my mind about two things. One is that the Communications Decency Act, I think, should be amended so that it no longer gives platforms like Facebook complete protection from lawsuits where it is simply the forum for people posting things. I think it's time, any other news organization does have to take responsibility for what it posts. I think Facebook and other platforms should as well. That may have been a useful step to take when those platforms were in their infancy. They're not now. So I'd like to see the CDA amended. And the other thing is that local community publications, newspapers are just a really important part of the social fabric, and they are part of a way of correcting that kind of disinformation, and their business model has collapsed. And so you have these news deserts across so much of America where the only information that does spread is this wild currency of hysteria and rumors. And I don't know that there is any other business model than having the government provide grants for some of these local newspapers probably along the lines of arts grants that the like National Endowment for the Humanities gives, or the science grants that the National Science Foundation, for example, gives out, and have some independent panel that provides grants to local news organizations. So a few years ago, I would have thought that's a crazy idea. Now, I think if the alternative is news deserts, wild hysteria, an unraveling of the social fabric, I've changed my mind.
A lot of questions. I need to get back to this because there's so many questions from people about people in rural America and their motivations and the Trump supporters. Jacob asks quite simply, isn't it possible that a sizable portion of Trump supporters are racists and bigots?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, I think many are, but I think we should be really wary of stereotyping people. And so, some are and some aren't. And in general, I don't think it helps to clarify issues by calling people with labels like that. So, I don't think it advances the conversation to say that every, to lump people together in that way. But, are some Trump voters racist? Absolutely. I mean, I think that President Trump himself is a racist, and, it's on a new Quinnipiac poll says that 51% of Americans Trump racist, and the idea that a majority of Americans would consider their sitting president to be a racist and that he has some real chance of being reelected is just mind-boggling. Who would have thought in the 21st century? Who would have thought?
Or that they would be okay with multiple accusations of sexual assault.
Sexual assault, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's by my count, it's about 21 credible allegations of sexual assault against President Trump, and and a real uncertainty about whether he is in some form a Russian asset. And Dan Coates, the former director of national intelligence, believes, according to the Woodward book, and Coates hasn't denied it, that the DNI believes that the Russians have something on President Trump that leads him to behave in the way he does. It's mind-boggling. And, the law, 20,000 false or misleading statements, according to the account of the Washington Post. I've covered leaders all over the world in all kinds of places, and leaders invariably, they spin, they evade. I've never met somebody who will just look you in the eye and lie to you the way President Trump does. President Musharraf of Pakistan was a close second, but I'd say that Trump takes the cake.
So presumably his supporters know all this, right? I mean, it's not like it's not in the news 24/7. Maybe not in the news that they read, but they must know the broad outlines. They at least know about Access Hollywood. And yet it doesn't seem to matter. And so I think a lot of us are still just, as you say, throwing up our hands and saying it's mind-boggling. We still can't wrap our minds around it, our arms around how he can evade serious censure by his supporters.
Well, so for example, I mean, I think that's often raised in the question, how can evangelical Christians, 81% of them support a man whose lifestyle is so, is about philandering, about violating everything that you would think the scriptures talk about. And I think one way of looking at that is that many of those evangelicals would acknowledge that Trump is not a model of personal behavior, but they would look at his judicial appointments. And I can kind of understand that. In 1996, in the Bill Clinton-Bob Dole election, I thought that Bob Dole was a finer human being than Bill Clinton. And yet I voted for Bill Clinton because, flawed as he was as a person, I thought that his policies for America would be better and that he would leave America in a better place. I think I was right about that. And so I can understand how evangelicals or Trump supporters more broadly can vote for a person they think is a liar, maybe even a racist, and a philanderer, and a assaulter, if they think that his policies will leave America, that much better. For many of them, they think every abortion is a murder, and so I think that's kind of where that comes from. But I do hope that this election will see some differences, partly because of the economy, as you mentioned. We tend to think of the Black working class as liberal and the white working class as conservative, but actually they're in some ways quite similar. Whether Black or white, the working class tends to be socially conservative, and so on issues of same-sex marriage or abortion, they tend to be more conservative. On issues of economics, they tend to be liberal, so they favor raising the minimum wage, for example. But African-American voters, despite that social conservatism, they go to the voting booth and vote for Democrats because issues of racial justice trump issues of those kind of values. And for the white working class, they have mostly, since Reagan, gone to the voting booth and voted Republican because those cultural issues have prevailed over the economic ones. At this time, when the economy is such a mess and so many people are unemployed and so many people are struggling to feed their kids, I have a feeling that there may be a lot of households that will vote their pocketbook rather than those issues of guns or abortion or whatever it may be.
I just want to end with, like I said, I promised a hope sandwich. And when I was doing research for this talk, I reread a column that you wrote last month about hiking the Pacific Northwest Trail with your family. And it was such a beautiful column because it really took the long view. You disengaged from technology and you were out in this incredibly rugged terrain, just at one with nature. And I was just wondering if you could leave us with a few words of wisdom and hope, that ideas you gleaned from that trip about the fact that history is long and the current political moment, it too shall pass.
Yeah, so that's my catharsis every year. I go off backpacking in the wilderness with family, and I see trails and mountains that I've hiked by all my life, and I see, and they kind of reassure me, and they hold me, and I cross the creeks that are both the same, but as Heraclitus said, they're always changing. And I guess I'd also say that in my journalistic career, I've seen truly far-reaching changes that do reassure me. And for example, I mentioned the Knapp kids down the road, all 5 of whom are now dead. They grew up in an incredibly violent house where the dad was beating up their mom almost every night, shooting at her sometimes, traumatizing all those kids. And domestic violence, that was a huge part of American life for an awful lot of households. And in 1978, half of Americans said it was sometimes okay for a man to beat his wife with a stick or a belt. Half of Americans. Now pollsters don't even ask that question. Domestic violence, according to surveys of, victim surveys, suggests it has fallen by about half in those decades, because now there is a little bit of accountability. You think about the country's awakening to LGBT issues, and some progress on race, on on gender. More broadly, you know, the first international campaign by people on behalf, not of themselves, but on behalf of others, was only in the 1780s, the British anti-slavery movement. The first international relief effort was only in the Irish, the international effort to help with the Irish famine. So in that long view, there really is, I think, a measure of progress and compassion. And that's kind of why we wrote Tightrope, that there's so much pain and so much America. Communities of every complexion, and kids in particular, are so poorly served by the wealthiest country in the history of the world. We have the resources to solve these problems. We have the toolboxes to solve those problems. Solve is a grand word, to hugely mitigate those problems. What we've lacked is the political will. And maybe, just maybe, our problems are so manifest to all right now that that will help us develop and build up that political will and finally, belatedly begin to address them.
Well, thank you so much for a really stimulating and, yes, hopeful discussion. And it's just great to hear you and great to read you. So I urge everyone to read your book, Tightrope.
Thank you, Madeleine, and great conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining in.
Yeah, so, and thanks the thousands of you who are watching right now. And tune in next week. Warren Aldney will be here in my stead interviewing Carl Bernstein, so don't miss that. Thanks to David and Janice, and I'll see you next time. Bye.